It came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colours that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it, and they sat down to eat a meal. My name's Arthur. Thank you for joining me as we continue the story of Joseph from Genesis chapter 37. Jacob had settled into the land of Canaan and was living in the vicinity of Hebron. Since he had moved into the land, the older sons had taken responsibility for caring for the livestock, and this gave Jacob great opportunity to spend time with Joseph, the youngest of the children, as he trained him and educated him, and they built a strong relationship together. And evidently Joseph developed a strong commitment to God in this time. This made the other brothers envious. And the strength of this relationship was highlighted when Jacob gave Joseph a special coat, called the coat of many colours, or the tunic of many colours. But there were other differences between Joseph and his brothers. Joseph's mother had been Jacob's first love, and she was now dead. Joseph had a younger brother Joseph, who'd been born in the land of Canaan, but he was the last one of the children to be born up at Haran. As he grew older and began to spend time looking after the sheep with his brothers, he became distressed at their unrighteous behaviour. He brought an evil report concerning the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah to his father, and of course this didn't endear him to his brothers either. But then he had had two dreams. In the first one, the brothers were haymaking, and the brother's sheaths bowed down to his sheath. And in the second dream, the sun and moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. His father was not impressed. "Will your mother and I bow down to you?" But he took the matter on board, because he himself had experienced God's leading in dreams. Joseph didn't use his dreams to gloat over his brothers, or to try and take authority over them. He had simply reported these dreams in response to their envy and their hatred of him. Well, he was about 17 when his father sent him to see how his brothers were doing. They were looking after the sheep at Shechem, which was a fair way north of Hebron. But when he got there, they were not there. They'd moved to Dothan. And when he caught up with them, they saw him coming. They schemed first to kill him, but Reuben protested, "No, let's not kill him." And so they stripped him of his coat and threw him into a pit, and sat down to eat a meal. There was obviously no remorse there, but rather a sense of satisfaction, a sense of happiness. For they said, "Let's see what becomes of his dreams now." For a common way to celebrate is, of course, to feast. We continue the reading in verse 25 of Genesis 37. "Then they lifted up their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh.' And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit, Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, 'The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go?' So they took Joseph's tunic, killed the kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colours, and they brought it to their father and said, 'We have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?' And he recognized it and said, 'It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces.' Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. The traders that the brothers traded with are called Midianite and Ishmaelite. The Ishmaelites were descended from Ishmael, the first son of Abraham, born to Hagar. So they were distant cousins. And the Midianites were descended from Midian, one of the later sons of Abraham, born to Keturah. So again, these were relatives, and evidently the Midianites and the Ishmaelites were working together in trading with Egypt. And so they are identified both as Midianite traders and as Ishmaelites. It was Judah who had the idea, what profit if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Then it will not be our responsibility what happens to him. But he is our flesh. And the brothers listen to him. So when Reuben fails in his plan because he didn't make a clear stand, Judah actually does succeed in saving Joseph's life. They sold Joseph for 20 shekels of silver. Now, Joseph was, of course, not an ordinary slave. He was strong, young, intelligent, educated, and we see that as the story goes on. So this was quite a high price. 20 shekels of silver would mean 2 shekels each for the 10 brothers who were there, for Benjamin the youngest would have still been at home. And so it is the responsibility of the 10 that they have sold their brother. We see the callousness of these young men, for Reuben the oldest was no older than 30. When they take the tunic, dip it in blood, and send it to their father with a message, we found this, do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not? And of course Jacob recognises Joseph's tunic and concludes that his son has been killed, which is of course what the brothers intended. They didn't want to take responsibility for what had happened to Joseph. But they didn't count on their father's reaction. Jacob sincerely loved Joseph, and he was distraught, and he remained distraught for many, many years afterwards. And all his sons and his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. He was not going to ever get over the loss of this son whom he had loved. This is a father's love for his son. Abraham had loved Ishmael, but God had set aside Ishmael as a son of the flesh and chosen Isaac to receive the promise of inheriting the land. There was no such substitution going on here. There was nothing to take the focus away from the loss of Joseph. But of course, Joseph was not dead. He was just out of sight. And God had a great plan, the Midianites having sold him to an officer of Pharaoh, a captain of the guard, a senior official in Egypt, because Joseph was no ordinary slave. And so as the story of Joseph reminds us of the story of Jesus, the brothers had disposed of Joseph, even as the Israelites had had Jesus executed. He'd gone into the grave, and they have seen him no more. But of course, Jesus is not dead. He rose again, and he is exalted at the Father's right hand, and he is establishing the church, a Gentile kingdom, at this time. But the day will come when the brothers will be reconciled to Joseph, and the Jews will be reconciled to Jesus when they are ready to bow down before him as their king.